technical difficulties. All right, let's get started. All right, so today we're going to be reading The Hobbit. I have this nice leatherette-bound edition. It comes in a cool little case like this. I got this at Powell's Books a couple years ago as kind of like, oh, let's buy a edition of a book that I like that I'll never read, so I can look at it and be like, wow, what a great book this is. Now let me open this crappy paperback version, that I actually read, so I don't get nasty fingerprints over the nice one. But we're going to bust open the good one today because it's a special occasion. It's Saturday. I have nothing to do. All right, so I think let's get started, eh? The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, by J.R.R. Tolkien. And this edition is illustrated by the author, so I can show you the panels when they come up. They're pretty fun. Here's a nice map. You gotta love, the fantasy books and their fold-out maps. This one doesn't fold out. Some of the editions do. I kind of like those. Kind of feels like it's like a little more included than printed on. But, this is fine. All right, we're going to start here with the preface. This is a story of long ago. At that time, the languages and letters were quite different from ours today. English is used to represent the languages. But 2 points may be noted. 1. In English, the only correct plural of dwarf is dwarfs, and the adjective is dwarfish. In this story, dwarves, with a V, and dwarvish are used, but only when speaking of the ancient people to whom Thorin Oakenshield and his companions belonged. 2. Orc is not an English word. It occurs in 1 or 2 places, but is usually translated as goblin, or hobgoblin for the larger kinds. Orc is the Hobbit's form of the name given at that time to these creatures, and is not connected at all with our orc, one's with a C, one's with a K, applied to sea animals of dolphin kind. Runes were old letters originally used for cutting or scratching on wood, stone, or metal, and so were thin and angular. At the time of this tale, only the dwarves made regular use of them, especially for private or secret records. Their runes in this book are represented by English runes, which are known to a few people. If the runes on Thror's map are compared with the transcriptions in modern letters, on pages 29 and 63, the alphabet adapted into modern English can be discovered, and the above runic title also read. I think this says, I don't know, I can look in for that later. I don't have time to decode things right now. Reading a book. On the map, all the normal runes are found, except for, it's a symbol here. I can't really pronounce a rune. Blah, 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 blah. Anyways, more notes on runes, more notes on runes. On the map, the compass points are marked in runes with east at the top, as usual dwarf maps, and so are read clockwise to east, south, west, and north. Anyway, the reason for this use is given in the Lord of the Rings. So if you want to look up the fun facts later, you can check out the appendices there. We're not going to do that today. We're just going to read The Hobbit. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Party. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. It had a perfectly round door like a porthole, painted green with a shiny yellow brass knob in the exact middle. The door opened on a tube-shaped hall like a tunnel, a very comfortable tunnel without smoke, paneled walls and floors, tiled and carpeted, provided with polished chairs and lots of pegs for hats and coats. The hobbit was very fond of visitors. The tunnel wound on, going fairly, but not quite straight, into the side of the hill. The hill, as the people for many miles around called it, and many little round doors opened out of it. First on one side and then on another. No going upstairs for the hobbit. Bedrooms, bathrooms, cellars, pantries, lots of these. Wardrobes, he had whole rooms devoted to clothes. Kitchens, dining rooms, all were on the same floor, and indeed on the same passage. The best rooms were all on the left-hand side, going in, for these were the only ones to have windows, deep-set round windows looking over his garden, and the meadows beyond, sloping down to the river. This hobbit was a very well-to-do hobbit, and his name was Baggins. The Bagginses had lived in the neighborhood of the hill for time out of mind, and people considered them very respectable, not only because most of them were rich, but also because they never had any adventures or did anything unexpected. You could tell what a Baggins would say on any question without the bother of asking him. This is the story of how a Baggins had an adventure, and how he found himself doing and saying things altogether unexpected. He may have lost the neighbor's respect, but he gained, well, you will see whether he gained anything in the end. The mother of our particular hobbit. What is a hobbit? I suppose hobbits need some description nowadays, since they have become rare and shy of the big people, as they call us. They are, or were, a little people, half our height, and smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There is little to no magic about them, except the ordinary everyday sort, which helps them disappear quietly and quickly when large, stupid folk like you or me come blundering along, making noise like elephants, which they can hear a mile off. They are inclined to be fat in the stomach. They dress in bright colors, chiefly green and yellow, wear no shoes because of their feet grow natural leathery soles, thick, thick warm brown hair like the stuff on their heads, which is curly. Have long, clever brown fingers, good-natured faces, and laugh deep, fruity laughs, especially after dinner, which they have twice a day when they can get it. Now you know enough to go on with. As I was saying, the mother of this hobbit, Bilbo Baggins that is, was the famous Belladonna Took, one of the 3 remarkable daughters of the old Took, head of the hobbits who lived across the water, a small river that ran at the foot of the hill. The small river that ran at the foot of the hill. You have the hill and the water. It's very good names for these things. It was often said in other families that Took long ago, one of the Took ancestors must have taken a fairy wife. That was, of course, absurd, but there certainly was a little something not entirely hobbit-like about them, and once in a while members of the Took clan would go and have adventures. He discreetly disappeared, and the family hushed it up. But the fact remains that the Tooks were not as respectable as the Bagginses, though they were undoubtedly richer. Not that Belladonna Took had any adventures after she became Mrs. Bungo Baggins. Bungo, that was Bilbo's father, built the most luxurious hobbit hole for her, and partly with her money. That was to be found on either under the hill or over the hill, or across the water. And there they remained until the end of their days. Still, it is probable that Bilbo, her only son, although she looked and behaved exactly like a second edition of his solid and comfortable father, got something a bit queer from his makeup, from the Took side, something that only waited for a chance to come out. The chance never arrived until Bilbo Baggins was grown up, being about 50 years old or so, and living in the beautiful hobbit hole built by his father, which I have just described for you, until he had in fact apparently settled down quite immovably. By some curious chance, one morning long ago in the quiet of the world, when there was less noise and more green, the hobbits were still numerous and prosperous, and Bilbo Baggins was standing at the door after breakfast, smoking an enormous long wooden pipe that reached nearly down to his woolly toes, neatly brushed. Gandalf came by. Gandalf. If you ever heard a quarter of what I have heard about him, and I have only heard very little there is to hear, you would be prepared for any sort of remarkable tale. Tales and adventures sprouted up all over the place where he went, in the most extraordinary fashion. He had not been down that way, under the hill, for ages and ages, not since his friend the old Took had died. In fact, and the hobbits had almost forgotten what he looked like. And he had been away over the hill and across the water on businesses of his own since they were all small hobbit boys and hobbit girls. All that the unsuspecting Bilbo saw that morning was an old man with a staff. He had a pointed and blue excuse me. He had a tall pointed blue hat and a long grey cloak, a silver scarf over which his long white beard hung down below his waist, and immense black boots. "Good morning," said Bilbo, and he meant it. The sun was shining and the grass was very green, but Gandalf looked at him under his long bushy eyebrows that stuck out further under the brim of his shady hat. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning, or do you mean that it is morning to be good?" Or, I'm sorry, gotta, work out these voices. That's the most important part. "What do you mean?" he said. "Do you wish me a good morning? Or do you mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not? Or that you feel good this morning, or that it is a morning to be good on?" "All of them at once," said Bilbo, "and a very fine morning for a pipe of tobacco out of doors, into the bargain. If you have a pipe about you, sit down and have a fill of mine. There's no hurry. We have all the day before us." Then Bilbo sat down on the seat by his door, crossed his legs, and blew a beautiful grey ring out of the smoke that sailed up into the air without breaking, floated away over the hill. "Very pretty," said Gandalf, "but I have no time to blow smoke rings this morning. I am looking for someone to share in an adventure that I am arranging, and it's very difficult to find anyone." "I should think so, in these parts. We are plain, quiet folk that have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing things. Make you late for dinner. I can't think what anybody sees in them," said our Mr. Baggins, and stuck one thumb behind his braces and blew out an even bigger smoke ring. Then he took out his morning letters and began to read, pretending to take no more notice of the old man. He had decided that he was not quite his sort and wanted him to go away. But the old man did not move. He stood leaning on his stick and gazing at the hobbit without saying anything, till Bilbo got quite uncomfortable and even a little cross. "Good morning," he said at last. "We don't want any sort of adventures here today, thank you. You might try over the hill and across the water." By this he meant that the conversation was at an end. "What a lot of things you use good morning for," said Gandalf. "Now you mean you want to get rid of me, and it won't be good until I move off." "Not at all, my dear sir. Let me see. I don't think I know your name." "Yes, yes, my dear sir, and I do know your name, Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and you do know mine, though you don't know that I remember that I belong to it. I am Gandalf, and Gandalf means me. To think that I should live to be good morning to by Belladonna Took's son, as if I was selling buttons at the door." "Gandalf, Gandalf, gracious me! Not the wandering wizard that gave old Took a pair of magic diamond studs, and fastened themselves and never came undone till ordered? Not the fellow who used to tell such wonderful tales at parties about dragons and goblins and giants and the rescues of princesses and the unexpected luck of widows' sons? Not the man that used to make such particularly excellent fireworks? I remember those. Old Took used to have them at Midsummer's Eve. Splendid! They used to go up in great lilies and snapdragons and laburnums and fire and hang in the twilight all evening." You will notice already that Mr. Baggins was not was not quite so prosy as you like to believe. Also that he was very fond of flowers. "Dear me," he went on, "not the Gandalf who was responsible for so many quiet lads and lasses going off into the blue for mad adventures, anything from climbing trees to visiting elves, or sailing ships to other shores. Bless me! Life used to be such I mean, you used to upset things quite badly in these parts once upon a time. I beg your pardon, but I have no idea you were still in the business." "Where else should I be?" said the wizard. "All the same, I am pleased to find you remember something about me. You seem to remember my fireworks kindly, at any rate, and that is not without hope. Indeed, for your old grandfather Took's sake, and for the sake of poor Belladonna, I will give you what you asked for." "I beg your pardon, but I haven't asked for anything." "Yes, you have, twice now. My pardon. I give it to you. In fact, I will go so far as to send you on this adventure. Very amusing for me, very good for you, and very profitable too, very likely, if you ever get over it." "Sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you. Not today. Good morning. But please come to tea any time you like. Why not tomorrow? Come tomorrow. Goodbye." And with that, the hobbit turned quickly and scuttled inside his round green door, and shut it quickly as he dared, not to seem rude. Wizards, after all, are wizards. "What on earth did I ask him to tea for?" he said to himself, as he last went into the pantry. He'd only just had breakfast, but he thought a cake or two and a drink of something would do him good after his fright. Gandalf, in the meantime, was standing outside the door, laughing long but quietly. After a while, he stepped up, and with a spike on his staff, scratched a queer sign on the hobbit's beautiful green front door. Then he strode away, just about the time when Bilbo was finishing his second cake, and beginning to think he had escaped his ventures very well. The next day he had almost forgotten about Gandalf. He did not remember things very well, unless he put them down on his engagement tablet, like this: Gandalf, tea, Wednesday. Yesterday he had been too flustered to do anything of the kind. Just before tea time there came a tremendous ring on the front doorbell, And then he remembered. He rushed to put on the kettle and put another cup and saucer and an extra cake or two and ran to the door. "I'm so sorry to keep you waiting," he was going to say, as he saw when he saw that it was not Gandalf at all. It was a dwarf with a blue beard tucked into a golden belt and very bright eyes under his dark green hood. As soon as the door was opened, he pushed inside, just as if he had been expected. He hung up his hooded cloak on the nearest peg and said, "Dwalin, at your let's see, what's a good dwarf voice? "Dwalin, at your service," he said with a low bow. "Bilbo Baggins at yours," said the hobbit, too surprised to ask any questions for the moment. When the silence had followed had become quite uncomfortable, he added, "I'm just about to take tea. Pray come and have some with me." A little stiff, perhaps, but he meant it kindly. And what would you do if an uninvited dwarf came along and hung his things up in your hall without a word of explanation? They had not been at the table long. In fact, they had hardly reached the third cake when there came an even louder ring at the bell. "Excuse me," said the hobbit, and he went off to take the door. "So you have got here at last." That was what he was going to say if Gandalf this time, but it was not Gandalf. Instead, there was a very old-looking dwarf on the step, with a white beard and a scarlet hood, and he too hopped inside as soon as the door was open, just as if he had been invited. "I see they've begun to arrive already," he said, when he caught sight of Dwalin's green hood hanging up. He hung his red one next to it. "Balin at your service," he said, with his hand on his breast. "Thank you," said Bilbo with a gasp. It was not the correct thing to say, but they have begun to arrive, and flustered him badly. He liked visitors, but he liked to know them before they had arrived, and he preferred to ask them himself. He had a horrible thought that the cakes might run short, and then he, as the host, he knew his duty, and he stuck to it however painfully, he might have to go without. "Come along in and have some tea," he managed to say after taking a deep breath. "A little beer would suit me better." "It's all the same to you, my good sir," said Balin with a white beard. "And I don't mind some cake, seed cake, if you have any." "Lots," Bilbo found himself answering, to his own surprise, and he found himself scuttling off to the cellar to fill a pint beer mug, and then to the pantry to fetch 2 beautiful round seed cakes which he had baked that afternoon for his after-supper morsel. When he had got back, Balin and Dwalin were talking at the table like old friends. As a matter of fact, they were brothers. Bilbo plumped down the beer and the cake in front of them, when a loud ring came at the bell, and then another ring. Gandalf for certain this time, he thought, and puffed along the passage, but it was not. It was 2 more dwarves, both with blue hoods, silver belts, and yellow beards, and each of them carried a bag of tools and a spade. In they hopped, and as soon as the door began to open, Bilbo was hardly surprised at all. "Well, what can I do for you, my dwarf?" he said. "Keely at your service," said the other one. "And Feely," added the other, and they both swept off their blue hoods and bowed. "At yours and your families," replied Bilbo, remembering his manners this time. Dwalin and Balin are already here, I see," said Keely. "Let us join the throng." "Throng?" thought Mr. Bilbo. Oh, sorry, thought Mr. Baggins. It's a thirsty chapter. I don't like the sound of that. I really must sit down for a minute and collect my wits, and have a drink. He had only just had a sip, in the corner, when the 4 dwarfs sat round the table as they talked about mines and gold and troubles with the goblins, and then all of the depredations of dragons and lots of other things which he did not understand, and did not want to, for they sounded like much too adventurous, when, ding dong, his bell rang again, as if some naughty little hobbit boy was trying to pull the handle off it. "Someone at the door," he said, blinking. "Some 4, I should say, by the sound," said Feely. "Besides, we saw them coming along behind us in the distance." The poor little hobbit sat down in the hall and put his head in his hands, and wondered what had happened and what was going to happen, and whether they would all stay to supper. Then the bell began to ring again louder than ever, and he had to go run to the door. It was not 4 after all, it was 5. Another dwarf had come along while he was wandering in the hall. He had hardly turned the knob before they were all inside, bowing and saying, "At your service," one after another. Dory, Nori, Ori, Owen, and Glowin, they were their names. And very soon 2 purple hoods, a grey hood, a brown hood, and a white hood were all hanging on the pegs, and off they marched, with their broad hands stuck in their gold and silver belts to join the others. Already it had almost become a throng. Some called for ale, and some called for porter, and one for coffee, and all of them for cakes, for the hobbit was kept very busy for a while. A bit of jug, a big jug of coffee had just been set down on the hearth. The seed cakes were gone, and the dwarves were starting a round of buttered scones when there came a loud knock. Not a ring, but a hard rat-tat on the hobbit's beautiful green door. Somebody was banging with a stick. Bilbo rushed along the passage, very angry, altogether bewildered and bewithered. This was the most awkward Wednesday he had ever remembered. He pulled open the door with a jerk, and they all fell in, one on top of each other, one on top of the other. More dwarves, 4 more, and there was Gandalf behind them, leaning on his staff and laughing. He had made quite a dent in the beautiful door. He had also, by the way, knocked out the secret mark that he had put there the morning before. "Carefully, carefully," he said. "It's not like you, Bilbo, to keep friends waiting on the mat. And then opening the door like a popgun. Let me introduce Biffa, Boffa, Bomber, and especially Thorin." "At your service," said Biffer, Boffer, and Bomber, standing in a row. They hung up 2 yellow hoods and a pale green one, and also a sky blue one with a long silver tassel. This last belonged to Thorin, an enormously important dwarf, and in fact no other than the great Thorin Oakenshield himself, who was not at all pleased at falling flat on Bilbo's mat with Biffer, Boffer, and Bomber on top of him. For one thing, Bomber was immensely fat and heavy. Thorin, indeed, was very haughty, and said nothing about service. But poor Mr. Baggins said he was very sorry so many times that at last he grunted, "Pray don't mention it," and stopped frowning. "Now here we all are," said Gandalf, looking at the row of 13 hoods, and the best attachable party hoods, and his own hat hanging on the pegs. "Quite a merry gathering. I hope there is something left for the latecomers to eat and drink. What's that? Tea? No, thank you. A little red wine, I think, for me." "And for me," said Thorin. "And raspberry jam and apple tart," said Biffer. "And mince pies and cheese," said Boffer. "And pork pie and salad," said Bomber. "And more cakes, and more ale, and more coffee, if you don't mind," called the other dwarfs through the window. "Put on a few eggs, there's a good fellow," Gandalf called after him, and the hobbits stumped off to the pantries. "And just bring out the cold chicken and pickles." "Seems to know much about the inside of my larders as I do myself," thought Mr. Baggins, who was feeling positively flummoxed, and was beginning to wonder whether the most wretched adventure had not come right into his house. By the time he had got out all the bottles and dishes and knives and forks and glasses, and plates and spoons and things that piled up on big trays, he was getting very hot, red in the face, and annoyed. "Confiscate and bother these dwarves," he said aloud. "Why don't they come and lend a hand?" Lo and behold, there stood Balin and Dwalin at the door of the kitchen, and Feeling Killy right behind them. Before he could say knife, they had whisked away a couple of small tables onto the parlor and set out everything afresh. Gandalf sat at the head of the party, with the 13 dwarves all round, and Bilbo sat on a stool at the fireside, nibbling on a biscuit. His appetite was quite taken away, and trying to look as if this was all perfectly ordinary and not in the least a bit an adventure. The dwarves ate, and talked, and time got on. At last they pushed their chairs back, and Bilbo made another move to collect the plates and the glasses. "I suppose you will all stay to supper," he said in his politest, unpressing tones. "Course," said Thorin, "and after. We shan't get it through on this business until late, and we must have some music first. Now, to clear up." Thereupon the 12 dwarves, not Thorin, he was too important, and stayed and talked to Gandalf, jumped into their feet and made tall piles of all things. Off they went, not waiting for trays, balancing columns of plates, each with a bottle on top, and with one hand, while the hobbit ran after them, and most squeaking with fright, "Please be careful, please don't trouble, I can manage." The dwarves only started to sing, and here I'm not going to sing, I'm just going to read the words. Sorry. I've only had this much so far, so you can't expect that much. Chip the glasses and crack the plates, blunt the knives and bend the forks. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates. Smash the bottles and burn the corks. Cut the cloth and tread on the fat. Pour the milk on the pantry floor. Leave the bones on the bedroom mat. Splash the wine on every door. Dump the crooks in a boiling bowl. Pound them up with a thumping pole. And when you've finished, if any are whole, send them down the hall to roll. That's what Bilbo Baggins hates, so carefully, with the plates. And of course they did none of these dreadful things, and everything was cleaned up and put away safe as quick as lightning, while the hobbit turning round and round in the middle of the kitchen, trying to see what they were doing. Then they went back, and found Thorin with his feet on the fender, smoking a pipe. He was blowing the most enormous smoke rings, and wherever he told one to go, it went up the chimney, or behind the clock on the mantelpiece, or under the table, or around the ceiling. But wherever it went, it was not quick enough to escape Gandalf. Pop! He summoned a smaller smoke ring from the short clay pipe, straight through each of the thorns, and then Gandalf's smoke ring would go green, come back, and hover over the old wizard's head. He had a cloud of them about him already. In the dim light, he made him look like strange and sorcerous. Bilbo stood still and watched. He loved smoke rings, and then he blushed to think about how proud he had been yesterday morning of the smoke rings he had sent up the wind and over the hill. "Now for some music," said Thorin. "Bring out the instruments." Healy and Feely rushed over to their bags and brought little fiddles. Dori, Nori, and Ori brought out flutes from somewhere inside their coats. Bomber produced a drum from down the hall. Biffer and Boffer went out too and came back with clarinets they had left among the walking sticks. Dwalin and Balin said, "Excuse me, I left mine on the porch." "Just bring mine in with you," said Thorin. And they came back with vials as big as themselves, and with Thorin's harp wrapped in a green cloth. It was a beautiful golden harp, and when Thorin struck it, music began all at once, so sudden and sweet that Bilbo forgot everything else, and was swept away into the dark lands and the strange moons, far over the water, and very far from his hobbit hole under the hill. Dark came into the room from the little window that opened up at the side of the hill, and the firelight flickered. It was April, and so it's April right now. And still they played on, while the shadow of Gandalf's beard wagged against the wall. The dark filled all the room, and the fire died down, and the shadows were lost. Still they played on. And suddenly first one, and then another began to sing. They played deep-throated singing of the dwarves in the deep places of their ancient houses. And this is like a fragment of their song, if it can be called like their song without their music. Far over the misty mountains cold, dungeons deep and caverns old, we must await ere break of day to seek the pale enchanted gold. The dwarves of yore made mighty spells, while hammers fell like ringing bells, in places deep where dark things sleep, then hollow halls beneath the fells. For ancient king and elvish lord, there many a gleaming golden hoard. They shaped and wrought, and light they caught, to hide in gems on hilt of sword. On silver necklaces they strung, the flowing stars, the crowns they hung, the dragon fire and twisted wire, they meshed the light of moon and sun. Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to claim our long-forgotten gold. Goblets they carved there for themselves, in heaps of gold where no man delves. There they lay long, and many a song was sung unheard by men and elves. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, its flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light. The bells were ringing in the dale, and men looked up with faces pale. Then dragons' ire, more fierce than fire, laid low their towers and houses frail. The mountains smoked beneath the moon, the dwarves they heard the tramp of doom. They fled their hall to dying fall, beneath his feet, beneath the moon. Far over the misty mountains grim, to dungeons deep and caverns dim, we must away ere break of day, to win our harps and gold from him. Just chokes you up. As they sang, the hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by the hands and by the cunning and by the magic moving through him, a fierce and jealous love, and the desire of the hearts of the dwarves. Then something tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains, and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls, and explore the caves, and wear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out the window. The stars were out in the dark sky above the trees. He thought of the jewels of the dwarves shining in the dark caverns. Suddenly in the wood, beyond the water, a flame leapt up, probably someone lighting a wood fire. And he thought of plundering dragons settling upon his quiet hill, and kindling it all to flames. He shuddered, and very quickly he was plain Mr. Baggins at Bag End, Underhill, again. He got up trembling. Had less than half a mind to go fetch a lamp, and more than half a mind to pretend to, and go out behind the beer barrels in the cellar, and not come out again until all the dwarves had gone away. Suddenly he found that the music and the singing had stopped, and they were all looking at him with eyes shining in the dark. "Where are you going?" said Thorin, in a tone that seemed to show that he guessed both halves of the hobbit's mind. "What about a little light?" said Bilbo apologetically. "We like the dark," said the dwarfs. "Dark for dark business. There are many hours before dawn." "Of course," said Bilbo, and sat down in a hurry. He missed the stool and sat on the fender, knocking over a poker and a shovel with a crash. "Hush!" said Gandalf. "Let Thorin speak." And this is how Thorin began. "Gandalf, dwarves, and Mr. Baggins, we are met together in the house of our friend and fellow conspirator, and this most excellent and audacious hobbit. May the hair on his toes never fall out. All praise to his wine and ale." He paused for breath, and for a polite remark from the hobbit. But the compliments were quite lost on poor Bilbo Baggins, who sat wagging his mouth in protest at being called audacious, and the worst of all, fellow conspirator. Though no noise came out, he was so flummoxed. So Thorin went on. "We are met to discuss our plans, our ways, our means, policy, and devices. We shall soon, before the break of day, start upon our long journey, a journey from which some of us, or perhaps all of us, except our friend and counselor, the ingenious wizard Gandalf, may never return. It is a solemn moment. Our object is, I take it, well known to us all. The estimable Mr. Baggins, and perhaps one or two of our younger dwarves, I think should be right in naming Keely and Feely, for instance. The exact situation at this moment may require a little brief explanation." This was Thorin's style. He was an important dwarf. If he had been allowed, he probably would have gone on like this until he was out of breath, without telling anyone there was anything that was not known already. But he was rudely interrupted. Poor Bilbo couldn't bear it any longer. At "may never return," he had begun to feel a shriek coming up from his inside, and very soon it burst out like a whistle of an engine coming out of a tunnel. All the dwarves suddenly sprang up, knocking over the table. Gandalf struck a blue light on the end of his magic staff, and in its firework glare, the poor little hobbit could be seen kneeling on the hearth rug, shaking like jelly that was melting. Then he fell flat on the floor and kept calling out, "Struck by lightning! Struck by lightning!" over and over again. And that was all they could get out of him for a long time. So they took him and they laid him out of the way on the drawing-room sofa, with a drink at his elbow, and they went back to their dark business. "Excitable little fellow," said Gandalf, as they sat down again. "Gets funny queer fits. But he is one of the best in a pinch, one of the best, as fierce as dragon in a pinch." If you have ever seen a dragon in a pinch, then you will realize this is only a poetical exaggeration applied to any hobbit, even to Old Took's great-granduncle Bolveror, who was so huge, for a hobbit, that he could ride a horse. He charged the ranks of the goblins at Mount Graham in the Battle of the Green Fields, and knocked their king Golfimble's head clean off with a wooden club. It sailed 100 yards through the air, and went down a rabbit hole, and in this way the battle was won, and the game of golf invented at the same moment. In the meanwhile, however, Bolver's gentler descendant was reviving in the drawing-room. After a while, and a drink, he crept nervously to the door of the parlor. This was what he heard, Glowin speaking, "Hrumph," or some sort of snort more or less like that. "Will he do you think? This is all very well for Gandalf to talk about the hobbit being fierce, but one shriek like that in a moment of excitement would be enough to wake the dragon and all his relatives, and kill the lot of us. I think it sounded more like a fright than excitement. In fact, if it had not been for the sign on the door, I would have been sure we had come to the wrong house. As soon as I clapped my eyes on the little fellow, bobbing and puffing on the mat, I had my doubts. He looks more like a grocer than a burglar." Then Mr. Baggins turned the handle and went in. His Took side had won. He suddenly felt that he would go without bed and breakfast to be thought, excuse me, to be thought fierce. As for a little fellow bobbing on the mat, it almost made him really fierce. Many a time afterwards, the Baggins part regretted what he did now, and he said to himself, "Bilbo, you were a fool. You walked right in and put your foot in it." Hmm. "Pardon me," he said. If I have overheard your words that you were saying, I don't pretend to understand what you were talking about, or to your reference of burglars, but I think that I am right in believing this is what he called being this is what he called being on his dignity, that you think I am no good. I will show you that I have no signs on my door. It was painted a week ago, and I am quite sure you have come to the wrong house. As soon as I saw your funny faces on the doorstep, I had my doubts, but treat it as the right one. Tell me what you want done, and I will try it. And if I have to walk away from here to the east of the east and fight the wild weirworms of the last desert, I had a great granduncle once. Bulbriller took, and yes, but that was long ago," said Glowin. "I was talking about you, and I assure you that there was a mark on this door, the usual one in the trade, or used to be. Burglar wants a good job, plenty of excitement, and reasonable reward. That's how it usually read. You could say expert treasure hunter instead of burglar if you like. Some of them do. It's all the same to us. Gandalf told us that there was a man of this sort in these parts looking for a job at once, and he had arranged for a meeting here at this Wednesday at tea time." "Of course there was a mark," said Gandalf. "I put it there myself, for very good reasons. You asked me to find the 14th man for your expedition, and I chose Mr. Baggins. Just let anyone say I chose the wrong man or the wrong house, and you can stop at 13 and have all the bad luck you like. Or go back to digging coal." He scowled so angrily at Glowin, the dwarf huddled back in his chair, and when Bilbo tried to open his mouth to ask a question, he turned he turned and frowned at him, and struck out his bushy eyebrows, till Bilbo shut his mouth tight with a snap. "That's right. Let's have no more argument. I've chosen Mr. Baggins, and that ought to be enough for all of you. If I say he's a burglar, then a burglar he is. Or will be when the time comes. There's a lot more to him than you guess, and a deal more than he has any idea himself, or you may possibly all live to thank me yet. Now, Bilbo, my boy, fetch a lamp, and let's have a little light on this." On the table, in the light, was a big lamp with a red shade. He spread a piece of parchment paper on. Let's see. I'm going to start that one again. On the table, in the light of the big lamp with a red shade, he spread a piece of parchment, rather like a map. "This was made by Thror, your grandfather Thorin," he said, in answer to the dwarf's excited questions. "It is a plan of the mountain. I Hang on, I gotta get my voices straight here. Should have practiced this, but what are you gonna do? Let's see. This was made by Thror, your grand. No, that's more of like a Thorin, isn't it? This was made by Thror, your grandfather Thorin," he said with the answer to the dwarf's questions. It is a plan of the mountain. It is a plan of the mountain." "I don't see how this will help us much," said Thorin disappointedly after a glance. "I remember the mountain well enough, and the lands about it, and I know where Mirkwood is, and where the withered hearth is, and where the great dragons bred." There is a dragon marked in red on the mountain," said Balin. "It was easy enough to find him without that if we ever arrived there." There is a point that you haven't noticed," said the wizard, "and that is the secret entrance. You see that rune on the west side, with the hand pointing to it from the other rooms? That marks the hidden passage to the lower halls. Look at the map on the beginning of the book. Sorry, this is the narrator's voice, which is my voice. Look at the map at the beginning of this book, and you will see the runes." "It may have been secret once," said Thorin, "but how do we know it's secret any longer? Old Smaug has lived there long enough to find out anything there is to know about those caves." "He may, but it can't have been used for years and years and years." "Why?" "Because it is too small. 5 feet high, the door, and 3 may walk abreast, say the runes. But Smaug could not creep into a hole that size, even when he was a young dragon, certainly not devouring so many of the dwarves and men of Dale." "It seems a great big hole to me," squeaked Bilbo, who had no experience of dragons and only of hobbit holes. He was getting excited and interested again, so that he forgot to keep his mouth shut. He loved maps, and in this hall there hung a large one of the country road with all his favorite walks marked on it in red ink. How could such a large door be kept secret from everybody outside, apart from the dragon? He asked. He was only a little hobbit, you must remember.
In lots of ways, said Gandalf. But in what way you see this one has been hidden, we don't know without going to see. What it says on the map, I should guess there is a closed door which has been made to look exactly like the side of the mountain. That is the usual dwarves' method, I think, isn't that right?
Quite right, said Thorin.
Also,
went on Gandalf,
I forgot to mention that there is a map with a key, a small and curious key. Here it is,
he said, and handed to Thorin a key with a long barrel and intricate wards made of silver.
Keep it safe.
Indeed I will, said Thorin. He fastened upon a fine chain that hung about his neck and under his jacket.
Now things begin to look more hopeful. The noise of this news alters them much for the better. So far, we had no clear idea what to do. We thought of going east, as quiet and careful as we could, as far as the Long Lake. After that, the trouble would begin. A long time before that, if I know anything about the roads east, interrupted Gandalf.
We might go up there from the river running, went on Thorin, taking no notice, and so to the ruins of Dale, the old town in the valley there, under the shadow of the mountain. But we none of us like the idea of the front gate. The river runs right out through the great cliff to the south of the mountain, out of which comes the dragon too, far too often, unless he has changed his habits.
That would be no good, said the wizard. Not without a mighty warrior, or even a hero. I tried to find one, but warriors are busy fighting one another in distant lands, and in this neighborhood heroes are scarce, or quite simply not to be found. Swords in these parts are mostly blunt, and axes are used for trees, and shields for cradles or dish covers. The dragons are comfortably far off, and therefore legendary. And that is why I settled on burglary, especially when I remembered the existence of a side door. And here is where Bilbo Baggins, the burglar, chosen and selected burglar. The burglar, the chosen and selected burglar. So now let us get on and make our plans. Very well then, said Thorin, supposing the burglar gives us some ideas or suggestions. He turned with mock politeness to Bilbo. First, I should like to know a little bit more about things, said he, feeling all confused and a bit shaky on the side, but so far still tookishly determined to go on with things. I mean, about the gold and the dragon and all that, and how it got there, and who it belongs to, and so on and further. Bless me, said Thorin. Haven't you got a map? Didn't you hear our song? Haven't we been talking about all this for hours?
All the same, I should like it plain and clear, he said obstinately, putting on his business manner, usually reserved for people who tried to borrow money off of him, and doing his best to appear wise and prudent and professional, and live up to Gandalf's recommendation. Also, I should like to know about risks, out-of-pocket expenses, and time requirement, and remuneration, and so forth. By which he meant, what am I going to get out of it, and am I going to come back alive?
Oh, very well, said Thorin. Long ago, in my grandfather Thor's time, our family was driven out far to the north, and came back with their wealth and their tools to this mountain on the map. It had been discovered by my far ancestor, Thrain, of old, but now they mined and they tunneled, and they made huger halls and greater workshops. In addition, I believe they found a good deal of gold and great many jewels, too. Anyway, they grew immensely rich and famous, and my grandfather was king under the mountain again, and treated with such reverence by mortal men who lived to the south and were gradually spreading up the running river as far as the valley overshadowed the mountain. They built the merry town of Dale there in those days. Kings used to send for our smiths, and reward even the least skillfully most richly. Fathers would beg us to take their sons as apprentices, and pay us handsomely, especially in food supplies, which we never bothered to grow or find for ourselves. Altogether, these were good days for us, and the poorest of us had money to spend, and land, and leisure to make beautiful things just for the fun of it, not to speak of the most marvelous and magical toys, the likes of which is not to be found in the world nowadays. So my grandfather's halls became full of armor and jewels and carvings and cups, and the toy markets of Dale was the wonder of the north. Undoubtedly, that was what brought the dragon. Dragons steal gold and jewels, you know, from men and elves and dwarves, wherever they can find them. And they guard their plunder for as long as they live, which is practically forever, unless they are killed. And they never enjoy a brass ring of it. Indeed, they hardly know a good bit of work from a bad, though they usually have a good notion from the current market value. And they can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armor. There were lots of dragons in the north those days, and gold was probably getting up scarce up there, with dwarves flying south and getting killed, and all the general waste and destruction that dragons make going from bad to worse. There was a particularly specially greedy, strong, and wicked worm called Smaug. One day he flew up in the air and came south, and the first we heard of it was a noise like a hurricane coming out of the north, and the pine trees on the mountain creaking and cracking in the wind. Some of the dwarves happened to be outside. I was one, luckily, a fine adventurous lad in those days, while always wandering about, and it saved my life that day. Well, from a good way off, we saw the dragon settle on the mountain in a spout of flame. Then he came down the slopes, and when he reached the woods, they all went up in fire. That time, all the bells were ringing in Dale, and the warriors were arming. The dwarves rushed out of the great gate, but the dragon was waiting for them. None escaped that way. The river rushed up in steam, and a fog fell on Dale, and in the fog the dragon came on them and destroyed most of the warriors. The usual unhappy story. It was only too common in those days. Then he went back and crept through the front gate, and routed all the halls, and the lanes, and the tunnels, alleys, cellars, mansions, and passages. After that there were no dwarves left alive inside, and he took all of their wealth for himself. Probably, for that is the dragon's way. He has piled it all up in a great heap far inside, and sleeps on it for a bed. Later, he used to crawl out of the great gate, come by night to Dale, carry people away, especially maidens, to eat, until Dale was ruined and all the people dead or gone. What goes on there I don't know for certain, but I don't suppose anyone lives nearer to the mountain than the far edge of the long lake nowadays. A few of us there were well outside and wept in hiding, and cursed Smaug, for there we were unexpectedly joined by my father and my grandfather, with singed beards. They looked very grim, they said very little, and when I asked how they got that way, they told me to hold my tongue, and said that one day in proper time I should know. After we went away, and have done what we had to do to earn our livings best we could, up and down the lands. Excuse me. Often sinking as low to blacksmith work or even coal mining. But we have never forgotten our stolen treasure, and even now, when I will allow that we have a good bit laid off to the side and are not so badly off, here Thorin stroked the gold chain around his neck, we still mean to get it back, and to bring our curses home to Smaug if we can. I have often wondered about my father's and my grandfather's escape. I see now that they must have had a private side door which only they knew about. But apparently they made a map, and I should like to know how Gandalf got hold of it, and why it did not come down to me, the rightful heir. I did not get a hold of it. I was given it, said the wizard. Your grandfather Thrall was killed, you remember, in the mines of Moria by Azog the Goblin. Curse his name, yes, said Thorin. And Thrain, your father, went away on the 21st of April, 100 years ago, last Thursday, and was never seen by you since. True, said Thorin. Well, your grandfather gave this to give to you. Sorry. Well, your father gave me this to give to you, and if I had chosen my own time and way for handing it over, you can hardly blame me considering the trouble. I had to find you. Your father could not remember his own name when he gave me the paper, and he never told me yours. So on the whole, I think I ought to be praised and thanked. Here it is, he said, handing the map to Thorin. I don't understand, said Thorin, and Bilbo felt he would like to say the same. The explanation did not seem to explain. Your grandfather, said the wizard, slowly and grimly, gave the map to his own son for safety before he went to the mines of Moria. Your father went away to try his luck with the map after your grandfather was killed, and lots of adventures and a most unpleasant sort he had. But he never got near the mountain. How he got there I don't know, but I found him a prisoner in the dungeons of the necromancer. Whatever were you doing there? Asked the one with a shudder, and all the dwarves shivered. Never you mind. I was finding things out, as usual, and a nasty dangerous business it was. Even I, Gandalf, only just escaped. I tried to save your father, but it was too late. He was witless and wandering, and he had forgotten almost everything except for the map and the key. We have long ago paid the goblins of Moria, said Thorn. We must give a thought to the necromancer. Don't be absurd. He was an enemy far beyond the powers that all the dwarves put together. If they could be all collected from the four corners of the world. The one thing your father wished for was that his son read the map and use the key. The dragon of the mountain are more than big enough tasks for you.
Hear, hear, said Bilbo, and accidentally said it aloud.
Hear what?
They all said, turning around suddenly towards him, and he was so flustered that he answered, Hear what I have got to say.
What's that?
They asked. Well, I should say that you ought to go east and have a look around. After all, the side door and dragons must sleep sometime, I suppose. If you sit on the doorstep long enough, I dare say you will think of something. And, well, don't you know, I think we have talked long enough for one night, if you see what I mean. What about bed and an early start and all that? I'll give you a good breakfast before you go.
Before we go, I suppose you mean, said Thorin. Aren't you the burglar? And isn't sitting on the doorstep your job, not to speak of getting inside the door? But I agree about bed and breakfast. I like 6 eggs with my ham when starting a journey. Fried, not poached. And mind you don't break 'em.
After all the others had ordered their breakfast without so much as a please, which annoyed Bilbo very much, they all got up. The Hobbit had found a room for them all and filled all his spare rooms and beds on and filled all of his spare rooms and made beds on the chairs and all the sofas before he got them all stowed away and went to his own little bed, very tired and not altogether happy. One thing he did make up in his mind about was not to bother to get up very early and cook everybody else's wretched breakfast. The tookishness was wearing off, and he was not so. Sorry, and he was not now quite so sure that he was going on any journey in the morning. As he lay in bed, he could hear Thorin still humming to himself in his best bathroom next to him.
Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day, to find our long-forgotten gold.
Bilbo went to sleep with that in his ears, and it gave him very uncomfortable dreams. It was long after the break of day when he woke up. All right, that takes us to Chapter 2, Roast Mutton. Gonna get it all. Lubricate there. All right. Up jumped Bilbo, and putting on his dressing gown, went into the dining room. There he saw nobody but all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room, and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real that Bilbo was forced to believe that the party the night before had not been a part of his bad dreams, as he had rather hoped. Indeed, he was really relieved after all that. Excuse me. Indeed, he was really relieved after all that. After all, to think that they had gone all without him, and without bothering to wake him up. But with never a thank you, he thought. And yet, okay, I need to take a bit of a break. Reading books is pretty hard, guys. Hang on. I'm gonna go, have a glass of water or something. Oh, alright. Nope, nope, not that one. Alright, we're back. Got our coffee. It's good. It's good. Alright. Chapter 2. Roast Mutton. I know I already read the intro here, but I'm going to start again because, you know. Up jumped Bilbo. Putting on his dressing gown, went into the dining room. There he saw nobody, but all the signs of a large and hurried breakfast. There was a fearful mess in the room and piles of unwashed crocks in the kitchen. Nearly every pot and pan he possessed seemed to have been used. The washing up was so dismally real, before Bilbo was forced to believe the party the night before had not been a part of his bad dreams, as he had rather hoped. Indeed, he was really relieved, after all, to think about that they had gone on without him, and without bothering to wake him up. But never with a thank you, he thought. And yet, in a way, he could not help feeling just a trifle disappointed. The feeling surprised him. "Don't be a fool, Bilbo Baggins," he said to himself, "thinking of dragons and all that outlandish nonsense at your age." So he put on an apron, lit the fires, boiled water, and washed up. Then he had a nice little breakfast in the kitchen before turning out the dining. By that time, the sun was shining and the front door was open, letting in a warm spring breeze. Bilbo began to whistle loudly and to forget the night before. In fact, he was just sitting down to a nice little second breakfast in the dining room by the open window when in walked Gandalf.
My dear fellow, he said, wherever are you going to come? What about an early start? And here you are having breakfast, or whatever you call it, 10:30. They left you a message because you could not wait.
"What message?" said Mr. Baggins, all in a fluster.
Great elephants, said Gandalf. You are not all today yourself this morning, or have you never dusted the mantelpiece?
"What's that got to do with it? Have never enough to do with washing up for 14.
If you had dusted the mantelpiece, you would have found this just under the clock, said Gandalf, handing Bilbo a note, written, of course, in his own notepaper.
This is what it said.
Thorne and Company, to burglar Bilbo, greeting. For your hospitality and sincerest thanks for the offer of professional assistance of our grateful acceptance. Terms, cash upon delivery, up to but not exceeding 1/14 of total profits, if any. All traveling expenses guaranteed in any event, funeral expenses to be defrayed by us or our representatives if occasion arises, and the matter is not otherwise arranged for. Thinking it unnecessary to disturb your esteemed response, we have proceeded in advance to make requisite preparations, and shall await your respected person at the Green Dragon Inn, Bywater, at 11 a.m. sharp, trusting that you will be punctual. We have the honor to remain, yours deeply, Thorin and Co. That leaves you just 10 minutes. You will have to run, said Gandalf.
But
no time for it, said the wizard.
But, said Bilbo again,
no time for that either. Off you go.
To the end of his days, Bilbo could have never remembered how he found himself outside, without a hat, a walking stick, or any money, or anything that he usually took with when he went out, leaving his second breakfast half finished and quite unwashed up, putting his keys into Gandalf's hands and running as fast as his feet could carry him down the lane, past the great mill, across the water, and then on for a mile or more. Very puffed he was, when he got to Bywater, just on the stroke of 11, and he found that he had come without a pocket handkerchief.
Bravo, said Balin, who was standing at the inn.
He was standing at the inn door, looking out for him. Just then, all the others came around from around the corner, the road of the village. They were on ponies, and each pony was slung about with all kinds of packages, parcels, and paraphernalia. There was a small pony, apparently for Bilbo.
Up you get, and off we go, said Thorin.
I'm awfully sorry, said Bilbo, but I have come without my hat, and I left my pocket handkerchief behind, and I haven't got any money, and I didn't get your note until 10:45 to be precise.
Don't be precise, said Wallen, and don't worry. You will have to manage without pocket handkerchiefs, and a good deal many of other things before you get to journey's end. As for hat, I've got a spare hood and cloak in my luggage.
And that's how they all came to start, jogging off from the inn on a fine morning just before May, on laden ponies, and Bilbo was wearing a dark green hood, a little weather-stained, and a dark green cloak borrowed from Dwalin. They were too large for him and looked rather comic. What his father Bungo would have thought of him, I daren't think. His only comfort was that he couldn't be mistaken for a dwarf, as he had no beard. They had not been riding for very long, when up came Gandalf on a very splendid white horse. He had brought a lot of pocket handkerchiefs, and Bilbo's pipe and tobacco. So after the party went along very merrily, and they told stories or sang songs as they rode forward all day, except of course when they stopped for meals. These didn't come quite as often as Bilbo would have liked then, but still, as he began to feel that adventures were not so bad after all. At first they had passed through the Hobbit lands, a wide, respectable country inhabited by decent folk, good roads and an inn or two, and now and then a dwarf or a farmer ambling on by his business. Then they came to lands where the people spoke strangely and sang songs Bilbo had never heard before. Now they had gone far into the lone lands, where there was no people left, no inns, and the roads grew steadily worse. Not far ahead were dreary hills rising higher and higher, dark with trees. On some of them rolled castles with an evil look, as if they had been built by wicked people. Everything seemed gloomy, for the weather that day had taken a nasty turn. Mostly it had been as good as May can be, even in merry tales, but now it was cold and wet. In the lone lands they had been obliged to camp when they could, but at least it had been dry. To think it will be June, grumbled Bilbo, as he splashed along behind the others in a very muddy track. It was after tea time, it was pouring with rain, and it had been all day. His hood was dripping into his eyes, his cloak was full of water, and his pony was tired and stumbled on stones. The others were too grumpy to talk. I'm sure the rain has gotten into dry clothes and into the food bags, thought Bilbo. Bother burgling and everything to do with it. I wish I was at home in my nice hole by the fire, with the jug and kettle just beginning to sing. It was not the last time that he wished that. Still, the dwarves jogged on, never turning round or taking notice of the hobbit. Somewhere behind the grey clouds of the sun must have gone down, for it began to get dark. They went down to the deep valley with a river at the bottom. Wind got up, and the willows along its banks bent and sighed. Fortunately, the road went over an ancient stone bridge, for the river had swollen with the rain, come rushing down from the hills and the mountains to the north. It was nearly night when they had crossed the river. The wind broke up, and the grey. The wind had broken up the grey clouds, and a wandering moon appeared above the hills and between the flying rags. Then they stopped, and Thorn muttered something about supper. And where shall we get a dry patch to sleep on? Not until then did they notice that Gandalf was missing. So far he'd come all the way up with them, never saying if he was in on the adventure or merely keeping them company all the while. He had eaten most, talked most, and laughed most, but now he was simply not there at all. Just when a wizard would have been most useful, groaned Dori Nori, who shared the hobbit's views about regular meals, plenty and often. There they decided in the end that they would have to camp where they were. They moved to a clump of trees, and where they thought it was drier under them. The wind shook the rain off the leaves, and the drip was most annoying. Also, the mischief seemed to have gotten to the fire. Dwarves can make a fire almost anywhere and out of almost anything, wind or no wind, but they could not do it that night, not even Owen and Glóin, who were especially good at it. Then one of the ponies took fright at nothing and bolted. He got to the river before they could catch him, and before they could go and get him out again, Feely and Keely were nearly drowned, and all the baggage that they carried was washed away off them. Of course, it was mostly food, and there was mighty little left for that supper, and less for breakfast. There they all sat, glum and wet and muttering, while Owen and Glóin went on trying to light a fire, quarreling about it. Bilbo was sadly reflecting that adventures were not all pony rides and May sunshine, when Balin was there with their lookout. When Balin, who was their lookout man, said, "There's a light over there." There was a hill some way off with trees on it, pretty thick in parts. Out of the dark mass of the trees they could see there was a light shining, a reddish comfortable-looking light, as it might be a fire or torches twinkling. When they had looked at it for some while, they fell to arguing. Some said no, and some said yes. Some said they had better... Some said they could but go and see. And anything was better than little supper, less breakfast, and wet clothes all the night. Others said, "These parts are none too well known, and are too near the mountains. Travelers seldom come this way, for the worse, and the road is unguarded. They have seldom even heard of the king round here, unless..." They have seldom heard of the king around here, and the less inquisitive you are to go as you go along, the less trouble you are likely to find. Some said, "After all, there are 14 of us." Others said, "Where has Gandalf got to?" This remark was repeated by everybody. Then the rain began to pour down worse than ever, and Owen and Glóin began to fight. That settled it. "After all, we've got a burglar with us," they said, and so they made off, leading their ponies, with all due proper caution, in the direction of the light. They came to the hill and were soon in the wood. Up the hill they went, but there was no proper path to be seen, such as what might lead to the house or a farm, and do what they could to make a deal, and do what they could, they made a deal of rustling and cracking and creaking, and a good deal of grumbling and ratting, as they went through the trees in the pitch dark. Suddenly, the red light shone out of the bright through the tree trunks, not far ahead. Now, it's the burglar's turn, they said, meaning Bilbo. You must go on and find out all about that light, what it's for, and if it's perfectly safe or canny, said Thorin to the hobbit. Now scuttle off, and come back quick if all is well. If not, come back if you can. If you can't, hoot twice like a barn owl and once like a screech owl, and we will do what we can. Off Bilbo had to go, before he could explain that he could not hoot even once like any kind of owl, and any more than fly like a bat. But at any rate, hobbits can move quietly in the woods, absolutely quietly. They take great pride in it, and Bilbo had sniffed out more than once at what he called all this dwarvish racket as they went along. But I don't suppose you or I would have noticed anything at all on a windy night, not if a whole cavalcade had passed 2 feet off. As for Bilbo, walking primly towards the red light, I don't suppose even a weasel would have stirred a whisker at it. But naturally, he got right up to the fire, for fire it was, without disturbing anyone, and this is what he saw. Three very large persons sitting round a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell. There was also a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that. From the great heavy faces of them, and their size, and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing-room fashion at all. At all.
Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton tomorrow,
said one of the trolls.
Never a blinking bit of man-flesh have we had for long enough, said the second. And we'll tell William a thinking bringing us into these parts beats me, and that drink rumming and sorts what's more, he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William choked. Shut your mouth, he said, as soon as he could. You can't expect folk to stop here, even just to it be you and Bert. You've had a whole village between the half of you since we've come down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up all the way when you've had said your thanks. Thank you, beer, for a nice bit of fat valley mutton from what it is. He took a big bite off of a sheep's leg while he was roasting, wiped his lips on his sleeve. Yes, I am afraid trolls really do behave like that, even those with only one head each. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he would have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try roasted dwarf or even pony for a challenge, or else he should have done a bit of quick burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point pick the trolls' pockets. It was nearly always worthwhile, if you could manage it. Pinched the very mutton off their spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their noticing him. Others, more practical but less professional pride, would have stuck a dagger in each of them before they observed it. Then the night could have been spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read a good many things, and he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed, as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorin and Company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of the various burglarious proceedings he had heard of, picking the troll's pockets seemed least difficult, so he crept behind a tree and just behind William. Bert and Tom went off to the barrel. William was having another drink. Then Bilbo plucked up his courage and put his little hand into William's enormous pocket. There was a purse in it, as big as a bag to Bilbo. Ha! He thought, as warming up to his new work as he lifted it carefully out. This is a beginning. It was. Trolls' purses are mischief, and this was no exception. Yeah, who are you? It squeaked as it left its pocket, and William turned around at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck before he
had time to duck behind the tree.
"Blimey, Bert, look what I've caught,"
Said William.
"What is it?"
Said the others, coming up.
"Blimey if I knows. What are ye?"
Bilbo Baggins, a hobbit, said poor Bilbo, shaking all over, wondering how to make owl noises before they throttled him.
"A Hobbit,"
They said, a bit startled. Trolls are slow on the uptake, and mighty suspicious about anything new to them.
"What's a Hobbit got to do with my pocket anyway?"
Says William.
"Can you cook 'em?"
Says Tom.
"You can try,"
Said Bert, picking up a skewer.
"It won't make more than a mouthful,"
Said William, who already had a fine supper.
"Not when he was skinned and boned. Perhaps there are more of 'em around and we can make a pie,"
Said Bert.
"Hey, you, or any more of your sort sneaking about these woods, you nasty little rabbit,"
He said, looking at the hobbit's furry feet. And he picked him up by his toes and shook him. Hey, yes, lots, said Bilbo before he remembered to give his friends away. No, none at all, he said immediately afterwards.
"What do you mean?"
Said Bert, holding him up the right way, by his hair this time. What I say, and please don't cook me, kind sirs. I'm a good cook myself, and I cook better than I cook, if you see what I mean. I'll cook you beautifully for you, a perfectly beautiful breakfast for you, if you only won't have me for supper.
"Poor little blighter,"
Said William. He had already had as much of his supper as he could hold, and he had lots of beer.
"Poor little blighter, let him go." "Not to what he says by lots and none at all,"
Said Bert.
"I don't like to have my throat cut in my sleep. Hold his toes by the fire till he talks."
I won't have it, said William.
"I caught him anyway." "You're a fat fool, William,"
Said Bert.
"I've said before this evening, and you're allowed. I won't take that from you, Bilbo Baggins,"
said Bert, and puts his fist in William's eye. Then there was a gorgeous row. Bilbo had just enough wits left when Bert dropped him on the ground to scramble out of the way of their feet. Before they were fighting like dogs, calling each other all sorts of perfectly true and applicable names in very loud voices. Soon they were locked in one another's arms and rolling neatly into the fire, kicking and thumping, while Tom whacked them both with a branch to bring them to their senses. And that, of course, could only made them madder than ever. That would have been the time for Bilbo to have left, but his poor little feet had been very squashed by Bert's big paw, and he had no breath left in his body, and his head was going round, so he lay there for a while panting, just outside the circle of firelight. Right in the middle of the fight, up came Balin. The dwarves had heard the noises from the distance, after waiting for some time for Bilbo to come back, or to hoot like an owl, and they started off one by one to creep towards the light as quietly as they could. No sooner did Tom see Balin come into the light than he gave an awful howl. Trolls simply detest the very sight of dwarves, uncooked. Bert and Bill stopped fighting immediately, and a sack. Tom quit, they said, before Balin, who was wondering where in all the commotion Bilbo was, knew what was happening. A sack was over his head, and he was down.
"There's more to come yet," said Tom, "or I'm a mighty mistook." "Lots and none at all it is," he said. "No hobbits, but lots of these here dwarves, that's about the shape of it."
"I reckon you're right," said Bert. Said Bert, and we'd best
get out of the light.
And so they did. With sacks in their hands they used for carrying off mutton and other plunder, they waded into the shadows. As each dwarf came up and looked in the fire and spilled jugs, and the non-mutton, surprised, pop went a nasty-smelling sack over his head, and he was down. Soon Dwalin lay by Balin, and Feely and Keely together, and Dory and Nori and Ori all in a heap, and Owen and Glowin and Biffer and Boffer and Bomber piled uncomfortably near the fire.
"They'll teach 'em,"
said Tom, for Biffer and Bomber had given him a lot of trouble, and it fought like mad, as the dwarves will when cornered. Thorn came last, and he was not caught or unawares. He came expecting mischief, and he didn't need to see his friend's legs sticking out of sacks to tell him that things were not all well. He stood outside the shadows some way off and said,
"What's the cause of all this trouble? Who has been knocking my people about?"
"It's trolls," said Bilbo from behind a tree. They had forgotten all about him. "They're hiding at the bushes with sacks," said he.
"Oh, are they?"
said Thorn as he jumped forward to the fire, before they could leap on him. He caught up a big branch all on fire in one end, and Bert got that end in the eye before he could step aside. Then he put a hold out, and that put him out of the battle for a bit. Bilbo did his best. He caught hold of Tom's leg as well as he could. It was thick and as a young tree trunk, but he was sent spinning up into the top of some bushes while Tom kicked with sparks in Thorn's face. Tom got the branch in his teeth for that, lost one of his front ones. It made him howl, I can tell you. But just at that moment, William came up behind and popped a sack right over Thorn's head, down to his robes. And so the fight ended. Nice pickle they were all in now, all neatly tied up in sacks. 3 angry trolls, and 2 with burns and bashes to remember, sitting by them, arguing whether they should roast them slowly, mince them up in fine and boil them, or just sit on them one by one and squash them into jelly. And Bilbo was up in a bush, with his clothes and his skin torn, not daring to move in fear they should hear him. It was just then that Gandalf came back, but no one saw him. The trolls had just decided to roast the dwarves now and eat them later. That was Bert's idea, and after a lot of argument, they had all agreed to it.
No good roasting them now, it'll take all night,
said a voice. Bert thought it was William's.
Don't start the argument all over again, Bill, he said, or it will take all night. Who's arguing? Said William, who thought it was Bert who had spoken. You are. You're a liar, said William,
and so the argument began all over. In the end, they decided to mince them fine and then boil them. So they put out a great black pot, and they took out their knives.
No good boil them. We ain't got no water, and it's a long way down to the well and all, said a voice.
Bert and William thought it was Tom's.
Shut up, they said, or we'll never have it done, and you can fetch the water yourself if you say any more. Shut up yourself, said Tom, who thought it was William's voice. Who's arguing but you, I'd like to know? You're a booby, said William. Booby yourself, said Tom.
And so the argument began all over again and went on hotter than ever until they had decided to sit on the sacks one by one and squash them and then boil them next time.
Who shall we sit on first? Said a voice.
Better sit on the last fellow first, said Bert,
whose eye had been damaged by Thorin. He thought Tom was talking.
Don't talk to yourself, said Tom. But he wants to sit on the last one. Sit on him. Which one is he? It's the one with the yellow stockings, said Bert.
Nonsense, it's the one with the grey stockings, said a voice like William's.
I was sure it was yellow.
Yellow it was. Then what did you say grey for?
Said Bert.
I never did. Tom said it.
Then I never did,
said Tom. It was you.
2 on 1, so shut your mouth, said Bert.
Who are you talking to? Said William.
I'll stop it, said Tom and Bert together. The night's getting on and dawn comes early. Let's get on with it.
Dawn take you all, and stone be to you, said a voice that sounded... Well, that didn't sound like any of the trolls' voices. That was Gandalf. But it wasn't. For just at this moment, the light came over the hill, and there was a mighty twitter in the branches. William never spoke, for he stood and turned to stone as he stooped, and Bert and Tom were struck like rocks as they looked at him. There they stand to this day, all alone unless birds perch on them, for trolls, as you probably know, must be underground before dawn, or they go back to the stuff of the mountains that they are made of, and never move again. That is what happened to Bert, Tom, and William. Excellent, said Gandalf, and he stepped behind a tree, and helped Bilbo climb down from a thorn bush. Then Bilbo understood. It was the wizard's voice that had kept the trolls bickering and quarreling, until the light made an end of them. The next thing was to untie the sacks and let out the dwarves. They were nearly suffocated, very annoyed, for they had not enjoyed laying there listening to the trolls making plans to roasting them, or squashing them, or mincing them. They had to hear Bilbo's account of what happened to him twice over before they were satisfied.
Silly time to go practicing pinching and pickpocketing, said Bomba, when what we wanted was fire and food.
And that's just what you wouldn't have gotten if any of those fellows without a struggle in any case, said Gandalf. Anyway, you're wasting your time now. Don't you realize the trolls must have a cave or a hole dug somewhere near to hide ones the sun in? We must look into it. They searched about, and soon found the marks of the trolls' stony boots going away through the trees. They followed the tracks up the hill, until, hidden by the bushes, they came to a big door of stone leading to a cave. But they could not open it, not though they all pushed while Gandalf tried various incantations. Would this be any good? Said Bilbo, when they were getting tired and angry. I found it on the ground where the trolls had their fights. And he held out a very largest key, though no doubt William had thought it very small and secret. It must have fallen out of his pocket, very luckily, before he was turned to stone. Why on earth didn't you mention it before? They cried. Gandalf grabbed it and fitted it into the keyhole. Then the stone door swung back in one big push, and they all went inside. There were bones on the floor, and a very nasty smell was in the air. But there was a good deal of food jumbled carelessly on the shelves in the ground, among the untidy litter of plunder, and all sorts of brass buttons and pots full of gold coins standing in the corner. There were lots of clothes, too, hanging on the walls, too small for trolls, I am afraid they belonged to the victims, and among them were several swords of various makes, shapes, and sizes. Two caught their eyes particularly, because of their beautiful scabbards and jeweled hilts. Gandalf and Thorin each took one of these, and Bilbo took a knife in a leather sheath. It would have made only a tiny pocket knife for a troll, but it was as good as a short sword for a hobbit.
These look like good blades,
Said the wizard, half drawing them and looking at them curiously.
they were not made by any troll, nor by any smith among men in these parts and days. But when we can read on the runes on them, we shall know more about them.
Let's get out of this horrible smell, said Fili. So they carried out the pots of coins and such food as was untouched and looked fit to eat, and also one barrel of ale which was still full. By that time they felt like breakfast, and beginning to feel very hungry, and they did not turn up their noses at what they had got from the troll's larder. Their own provisions were very scanty. Now they had bread and cheese and plenty of ale, and bacon to toast on the embers of the fire. After that they slept for the night, for their night had been disturbed. They did nothing more until that afternoon. Then they brought up their ponies, and carried away the pots of gold, and buried them very secretly not far from the track by the river, putting a great many spells on them, just in case they had ever had the chance to come back that way and recover them. When all was done, they had mounted once more, and jogged on again to the path to the east.
Where did you go, if I may ask?
Said Thorin to Gandalf as they rode along.
To look ahead,
Said he.
And what brought you back in the nick of time?
Looking behind, said he.
Exactly, said Thorin. But could you be more plain? I went on to spy out the road. It will soon become very dangerous and difficult. I was anxious about replenishing our small stock of provisions. I had not gone very far, however, when I met a couple of friends of mine from Rivendell.
Where's that? Said Bilbo.
Don't interrupt, said Gandalf. You will get there in a few days now, if you are very lucky, and find out all about it. As I was saying, I met two of Elrond's people. They were hurrying along for fear of trolls. It was they who told me that 3 of them had come down off the mountains and settled in the wood not far from the road. They had frightened everyone away from the district, and waylaid strangers. I immediately had a feeling that I was wanted back. Looking behind, I saw a fire in the distance and made for it. Now you know. Please be more careful next time, or we shall never get anywhere.
Thank you, said Thorin. And that's the end of chapter 2. My voice is pretty much shot after doing all those Cockney accents, so I'm going to take a little bit of a longer break, and then maybe we'll be back later. Thank you for joining me for